Hey everybody, this is Lord Tremendous here. I got a little something new for you. Obviously, I call it Tremendous's Tall Tales. Let me give you a little background. I'm running a Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 campaign in my local store with a handful of elite gamers. This campaign is set in Warhammer Fantasy World and will feature many familiar and semi-familiar items, locations, abilities, people, races, sets, stuff like that. Basically, the PCs, player characters, are far from safe. They can be killed permanently if they end up in a bad situation or encounter, have some bad luck, the stars align against them, whatever the reason is, they can be killed. I'm kind of going for a Walking Dead, Game of Thrones thing. There is no resurrection. There is no, hey, you're coming back unless they figure out how or somehow finagle away or, like invent dreadnoughts or something if you're familiar with 40K. But the idea behind it is it's a living story. It's fun. You never know what's going to happen. I set up the situations. They have to get through it. And how they get through it is the fun part, is the heroic part, is the interesting part. And so then I write it all down in a story-ish fashion and I narrate it to you. And we get to keep track of who, level, kills, cool achievements, things that they did that was really cool, or horribly awful or whatever. And yeah, it should be a lot of fun. I'm hoping it's a lot of fun. I'm hoping that you guys enjoy it. If not, well, I'll probably still do it because I enjoy it. So somebody's enjoying it at least, and that's what counts. Rooting for your favorite characters, suggesting missions, voting for events in the comment section is highly encouraged. Anything you want to contribute, anything you want to see. How many times have you been watching The Walking Dead or Game of Thrones or any Breaking Bad, anything that's cool? And you're like, man, I wish they would do this. Well, this could be your chance. It's just, it's not Hollywood or anything like that. So yeah, if there's something that you're watching, you're like, God, I would love to see them, up against this, or I'd love to see what would happen if they did that, or hey, I want my named character in this storyline. Throw it in the comment section. If I think it's a good idea, or I like the name, or if I need the name, or whatever, I'll throw it on there. I don't mind, as long as you're cool with that. And yeah, by all means, if you want your character to be some half god or whatever, say it. If you want your god to be some super powerful evil guy, say it. And if I need him in there, I can fit him in, I'll use him, and it'll be a lot of fun for everybody. But yeah, one more thing. Usually with my battle reports, stuff like that, I try to keep it family friendly. This is not family friendly. Let me be very, very clear on that. This game is designed with adult themes in mind. We have adult language, adult themes, adult situations, general adult stuff that kids probably shouldn't hear, see, or watch. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is we torture people. I describe gore. Dirty things are said. Swears are said. These guys are not in character. They're talking like you or me for the most part. I might have thrown an accent in there, but yeah, we're a bunch of adults with some adult beverages, way at night, just screwing around, having a good time. I'm going to swear. I'm going to say crude things. This is explicit. So if you're under 18 and your parents don't know you're listening to this right now, you should probably shut it off unless your parents are cool with this stuff. Go make sure they're cool with this stuff first, because this is not family friendly. This is an adult themed storyline. So now that I've gotten that disclaimer out of the way, I'll see you in court. All right, let me just start you guys off with the background, the history of this world that we're in. It's mostly Warhammer. It's a little bit different than the history from Warhammer the tabletop game. The history, the way most of us know it, is different in this world of Warhammer. In this world, after the Great Chaos Incursion, the High Elves did not staunch the flood of chaos with the Waystones. There was no Kaeldor. The tide of chaos was stopped at the last moment when all the races of Warhammer laid down their old grudges and hatreds, and they banded together. Mortal and immortal races alike. They, blood enemies, racial enemies, huge, atrocities committed in the past. They dropped all that because extinction was at their doorstep. I mean, they literally were like stuck in Rhode Island getting ready to be extinguished when they dropped the old, hatreds, the old animosities and bound together. The common enemy finally made them work as a team. The world banded together without exception, united, and fought back the demon hordes. Countless millions died on both sides. Entire towns were wiped off the map. Cities were just eradicated, and the devastation to the world was almost irreversible. However, with the world's survival on the line, the races proved to be slightly stronger than the demonic tide, and after 400 years of war, the final demon was vanquished and the warp gates were closed. The victory was as bitter as it was sweet, however. While the remnants of the world had won the war and vanquished the demonic threat, the world itself was decimated, and the populations of even the Skaven were just above extinction levels. 600 years of peace ensued where the races of Warhammer coexisted, more or less. I mean, they were still fighting, let's face it. You know, there's only so long an orc or a chaos guy or an ogre is going to stay peaceful, but huge big wars and armies sweeping through the lands and stuff like that for the most part were stopped for about 600 years, and everybody, all the races commingled in harmony for the most part. Mages from the orcs and goblins, Skaven and ogre kingdoms joined with mages from all three elven races to set about healing the damage to the world caused during the war. They healed the forests and unpolluted the rivers, made the air not toxic, took the ugh out of the world with their magics and stuff like that. It took them over 100 years to do it, but eventually their efforts proved fruitful, and now the world's forests, lakes, oceans, flora, and fauna are flourishing once again. Smiths from the Dwarven lands joined forces with smiths from the Skaven and Empire engineer guilds to repair the damage to the towns and cities of all the races. This took hundreds of years to accomplish. However, the engineering marvels created by the three races while working together have made the new towns and cities even more amazing than they ever were before. For example, warp lightning lanterns and electricity is very common in cities now. It kind of got a steampunk thing going on because of the Empire engineers. They took the steam tank technology and incorporated it into day-to-day operations. Like hot water is not uncommon. Some sort of heating, of the air and stuff like that. Steam power isn't crazy, and with the dwarven and smiths and everything like that, the cities and the towns that were rebuilt are smaller than their original size, but the walls are 10 times as strong and just as ornate and amazing as you would expect from dwarves. So everyone's celebrating after the War of Chaos. Finally, the Cataclysm War is how it became known. After it was finally over, and 5 months after the war ended, the dwarves made history with a stunning gift to the world. In front of what was left of the population, the new dwarf king, with the support of every surviving Thane, wiped the Book of Grudges clean. Not just the individual clans, the actual big Book of Grudges. He striked out every grudge in there. Regardless of how hideous the offense was or how awful they may have thought of somebody, he wiped the Book of Grudges clean, and he had the support of every surviving Thane to do it. The celebration of this momentous gesture lasted 10 straight days and is still sung about by bards to this day. In fact, it is popular for when two people are arguing or about to fight. If somebody gets in their way or tries to calm them down, you'll hear them scream, "Clear your books!" And that's in reference to the Book of Grudges being cleaned. The dwarven race has since grown to be honored by all the other races because of that just unbelievable gesture of kindness. The only race that was really unchanged by the events of the world are the savage chaos worshippers of the north. They do still exist. They do still worship their gods. They do still have contact with their gods. They still get the gifts and the mutations and all that garbage. It's still a dangerous place up north, but it's not as warped and twisted. The demons aren't there. The mortals are there. And how demons get into the world now is usually through miscasts, which are prevalent, or an intentional summoning or an intentional tear. The demons are right there. They want back in. They just don't have a doorway anymore. The doorway's been closed. So worshippers in north, the Norsec guys or whatever, they're always trying to get them back in and doing the evil things. So there is still a bad guy element to the world that never truly joined in. However, that doesn't mean that chaos worshippers aren't in, towns and stuff like that on a day-to-day basis. And while they're not greeted with open arms, it's the equivalent of them showing up and being like, if in our world you ran into a open devil worshiper or something, probably not somebody you're going to invite to your birthday party, but at the same time they're not doing anything quote unquote illegal, so you're going to just probably cross the street and leave them alone. The Warriors of Chaos, however, are a threat that never truly went away after the portals were destroyed. They still worship Tzeentch and Khorne, Slaanesh, and Nurgle, but no longer form up the massive armies they once did. Now that the Chaos gates are closed and stuff like that. For the most part, they're just trying to survive up there. Because needless to say, the mages didn't go up there and heal the lands or anything like that. They do still form smaller raiding warbands and set upon unexpected towns or outposts. They are still massacres out there where, farmland stuff get raided because, they gotta eat. The marauders do anyway. The threat of chaos is still out there. The threat of chaos is still out there, although the more civilized parts of the world are rarely affected by it. And it is in this setting that we meet our party. As of this session, we have a paladin who is devoted to Khorne. Like I said, the Norsec are shunned by society, to be certain, but no more than a devil worshiper would be in our world, and that's just an example. We have a dark elf cleric with a dark past and even darker agenda. We have a dwarven slayer who is the last of his clan and desperately seeks a glorious death so that he can rejoin his ancestors in the afterlife. And last but not least is a savage orc war boss with teeth, bones, and nails of solid gold. He earned that after being healed from a final transmutation spell by his goblin and orc shamans. This unlikely group of adventurers, I grant you that, have formed their own mercenary group, which is very common for outcasts and those that get bored easily during long stretches of peace. They have each joined for their own reasons and have their own agendas. As this saga unfolds, you will be given a front row seat to their adventure. And trust me, it's awesome.
You'll find more cheer in a graveyard.
Okay, this being the first ever Tremendous Tall Tales, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be keeping track of every single character that plays in this. Sometimes characters will come, sometimes characters will go, sometimes characters will die and new ones will spring up in their place. So in this situation, very first session or whatever, we have our leader, and he's leader by default. I rolled a d4 to determine which one would be the quote-unquote general of this group. As the general, the level 1 dwarven slayer, he's a fighter, but we act like he's a slayer. His name is Drake Yinlinson. He has, as of this moment, 0 kills, no injuries, and he hasn't done anything notable yet because we're just starting. As time goes on, this will be a working count, kill count, injuries, notable moments, and anything else cool that I just want to mention about him, like maybe he ripped the tongue out of a dragon and strangled him with his bare hands, or with the tongue he ripped out. Just cool stuff like that. He is technically, for now, until the party appoints someone else, if they appoint someone else, he is technically the quote-unquote general of this group. And how that translates into 3.5 is if you're familiar with it, you'll understand, and if not, fast forward. But yeah, how that'll translate is if somebody in the party that's within 50 feet of the dwarf has to take a willpower, fortitude, or reflex check, and their score is lower than the dwarfs, they can use the dwarfs' reflex, constitution, or willpower in order to test against that. So that's how generals are going to work in our game. Get the Warhammer fantasy feel to everything. Here is our background for our dwarf leader. Drake is the last surviving member of the great Brewmaster clan Yinlinson. During the Great Cataclysm War, his clan was destroyed after centuries of battle. During his clan's last stand, Drake found himself in a challenge against an exalted hero of Khorne, mounted on a terrifying juggernaut. After an intense fight, Drake was able to vanquish his foe, but the body of the juggernaut fell on top of him and began crushing the life out of him. Pleased with his final performance, Drake allowed the pain to take away his consciousness, knowing that when he awoke, it would be to the greetings of his ancestors. When Drake did awake, it was not to the faces of his fathers. It was to the face of a dark elven cleric. Furious, Drake demanded to know why he was still alive. The cleric, who identified himself as Aebon Darksun, told him that he had received a vision from his gods that the battlefield was not to be the dwarf's final resting place. It was he that rescued the dwarf and vowed to stay at his side until the gods took him to his final resting place. Drake, never one to disrespect the will of the gods, accepted Aebon's explanation and set out to find the destiny the gods had planned for him. During his adventures with his dark elf companion, he heard tales of the legendary Yinlinsing brewmaster recipes still existing. Invigorated by this new knowledge, Drake has made it his life's mission to recover this recipe that is said to be so potent that one sip can bring a person back from the brink of death, regrow limbs, and even make the gods drunk. Next up, we have our level 1 Dark Elf Cleric, Aebon Darksun. Some of you will know him. He is my opponent in my battle reports, my Dark Elf opponent, Death Holy Death. And yes, he is everything that you would hope for and more. He's, like I said, level 1 Cleric, Dark Elf Cleric. His kill count is 0, injuries are none, and achievements are none because it's the first session. And here's his background. This was written by Death Holy Death himself. Thud. The hammer feels good in my hand. I enjoy the feeling of the grip, the weight of the thing, and the strength of the steel. Each stroke drives the nail deeper into the blood-soaked wood. Too many of my people neglect the simple pleasures of basic craftsmanship. Carpentry, for example. Each fall of the hammer drives the nail deeper. The boy gazes on mutely, clutching the heavy bag of long nails. Shock, perhaps. It's hard to tell sometimes. I was young, only a boy, pounding my hands bloody, screaming. I don't remember what I was shouting. Terrified, my breath frosting the cold steel bars. I may have been crying. I didn't want to die. My brother laughed and smiled exuberant. I'd always hated his smile, the smug way he pursed his fat lips, one eyebrow raised in self-assured superiority. With me dead, he would be the only heir to our meager house. He rattled the keys just out of reach, safe inside the gate. Away, down the street, I could hear the crazed calls of the witches as the sun set on Harganeth on our most holy celebration, Death Night. As the blood-drenched she-elves closed on me, a curtain of darkness descended and I was pulled back, away from my doom. A voice whispered, clear and cutting as a blade of ice, "This one is ours." The witches wheeled and careened off down the street, searching for other victims. I cut down 11 small trees. One for each of them. It took 3 days to work them to the proper length and width. The crows ate the guards' eyes first. The prisoners had cheered me on in the struggle. Then they realized I was not their salvation. The boy had been tending the cart and surrendered when I slew the bondsman. The prisoners begged and pleaded at first, but soon lapsed into silence. I preferred that. I work better in silence. In the house of 1,000 voices, it is death to speak above a whisper. Laughter is forbidden. The dead do not laugh. Their mouths are filled with dust, their hearts with ash, their eyes with hatred. The Pale Queen dwells in silence, and because we honor our mother, we dwell in silence as well, the better to hear her voice when she speaks, in a voice without sound, to those of us who have ears to hear. The temple became my home after my death. My lessons were harsh, but well received. One master would teach the arts of faith, another the art of pain. My days were filled with devotionals and the memorization of the rituals and tools of the dark arts. My nights were pain. Sometimes I would be scourged or suspended from hooks and chains or branded or cut. Sometimes it was a poisoned caress or a word spoken in a dark speech that set my very soul afire. I learned these lessons willingly and with fervor. How can you understand the power of pain without intimate experience? Service requires sacrifice. Our service to the Pale Queen is a great work. Our sacrifice hones our souls and bolsters the host of the underworld for the inevitable day of our vengeance and the triumph of the dead. In the lands of men, they crucify their criminals on racks of 2 pieces of wood, sometimes in the shape of a sword blade, in the ground, but just as often in the pattern of an X, such as an illiterate man might sign a paper with. I nailed the first man's hands above his head and stretched him out the lengthways on a single piece of wood, and having nailed his feet below him, allowing enough slack in his limbs to allow him to push himself up. I affixed that into the ground next to the stream. I find it difficult to understand why men use 2 pieces of wood when 1 will do. Sometimes the Pale Queen visits me in my sleep and whispers to my soul. So she did in the 100th year of my life. To the south, in the lands of men, I would find one seeking to die. This one I would study. His life would instruct me in death. My masters judged my faith complete. Judged my training complete. From here on out, faith would be my guide. My brother did not recognize me as I shut the gate behind him. I cannot fault him for that. It has been so long since we were boys. I took his cloak for him and opened the door to the manor. He was holding a feast for some minor nobles of the city and had no time for the new help. It was a 7-course feast. By the end, my brother was sickeningly drunk and could barely stand. He managed to see his guest to the door. I helped him to his bed. He passed out, so insensate he hardly noticed as the household staff and I bound him hand and foot. I had spent some months buying the servants with a combination of greed and addiction. Each and every one belonged to me. I drive the nail into the man's feet, and he whimpers. It is cool here by the stream, some solace. I suppose for the dying who now begin their journey to the underworld, or whatever life awaits the race of men upon their death. The smell of cedar, blood, and rot mixes pleasantly with the scent of fresh water from the stream and the fragrant odor of earth. It is spring and flowers bloom on drooping vines. It is as a fine time as any there ever was to suffer and die. My brother woke naked, tied to a chair. I'm sure the pain was intense. I broke his knees. It wouldn't do to have the guest of honor resisting. His feast, we set the great table and all the finery of the house with my brother at its head. A 7-course meal. I sat at his right side, as is only proper for a younger brother. I flayed his right leg from ankle to knee and carved meat from bone. Of course he would have died if not for my healing arts. The meat was taken to the kitchen and roasted. And so we dined in celebration of my brother's 110th birthday, for that was the date. A 7-course feast. We ate roast swan, stuffed geese livers, soups of every description, bread and cake, and fine wine. And my brother ate himself, bite by bite, over the hours. We forced the meat of his legs and arms and loins into his mouth, and whittled him down to bone and scraps of sinew, maintaining his life with the black arts. My retinue was well and truly drunk by this point, and they hated him almost as much as I. I raised a final toast in his honor as midnight drew near. We drank deep, and they died, collapsing in seizures as the poison took them. It wouldn't do to have loose ends. Then I went and killed the cook. With that accomplished, I cut my brother's heart from his chest. Now I walk south, always south and east. I can see the blaze of fire on the horizon and the din of battle. My visions tell me this is where I will find the one I seek. I hear the whispers at night when I pray to the Pale Queen. There were 10 prisoners, but 11 stakes to be used. I don't think the boy realized what that meant until the first nail went into his hands. Well, next up we got the level 1 Savage Orc Barbarian. His name is Boss Goldtusk. His kill count is 0, his injuries are none, and his achievements are none, because it's the first session. What do you expect? Here's his background. Boss Goldtusk rose to power over his tribe after a devastating defeat at the hands of an Empire metal wizard. During this battle, Goldtusk was a battle standard bearer and reaped a huge body count. He watched with contempt as his war boss was melted into slag by one of the Who-Man's tricky spells. Goldtusk had no real love for the war boss, but felt that to allow his death to go unanswered was not something Gork, or possibly Mork, would want. Rearing back, Goldtusk hurled his battle axes at the enemy wizard and watched with satisfaction as the business end of both weapons embedded themselves into the puny wizard. Goldtusk snapped the neck of the wizard's halberdier bodyguard as he calmly walked over to the dying wizard to retrieve his weapons. As he reached for an axe, the wizard extended his arm and spat magical words at him. The war paint that covered Goldtusk's body flared as they tried to protect him from the wizard's final spell, but they weren't enough. Goldtusk watched in horror as his body became solid gold. He awoke in the middle of a goblin shaman magic circle with 3 of his clan shaman chanting manically around him. He saw that there had been 5 shaman at one point, and now 2 lay on the ground smoking as the power of Gork, or Mork, made their corpses smolder. Flexing his stiff muscles, he was surprised to find that his teeth and nails seemed to be gold still. After vigorous shaking of one of the surviving shaman, they explained he was bewitched by the dying wizard and became a solid gold statue. They were able to mostly reverse the spell, but that his bones, body, and teeth were still gold, and that was the will of Gork. Mork? This explanation made perfect sense to Goldtooth, and he found that his new solid gold bones, teeth, and nails gave him a major advantage in combat. In true Orcish fashion, Goldtooth quickly became Boss Goldtooth of his tribe by slaughtering his competition. Unfortunately, after rising to his coveted position, he discovered only a handful of orcs and some goblins remained of his tribe. Boss Goldtusk was determined to increase the numbers in his clan, and ordered his only surviving orc shaman, whose mentor's head now adorned Goldtooth's chest in the form of a ruby-eyed necklace, to transport the clan to the nearest orcish encampment so he could take them over as well. Clearly nervous, the orc shaman began casting the Hand of Gork. Unfortunately, this particular orc shaman had been very new still and botched the spell spectacularly. Boss Goldtusk found himself being hurled through the sky by a giant green hand. He sailed through the air for what felt like hours, and when he hit, the impact knocked him unconscious. Only his new solid gold fortitude enabled him to survive the impact, and he wandered the green fertile lands he found himself in for days before encountering anyone. The first living person he encountered was a very large human in blood-red armor that was caked in gore. Goldtusk greeted this human in traditional Orcish custom. He charged him. The resulting combat between the 2 warriors ended in a draw, with both of them carrying an assortment of minor to moderate wounds and limping. Recognizing each other as kindred spirits, they agreed on a truce and joined forces in order to better achieve their goals. Goldtusk, completely forgetting about his clan, now only wanted to explore this new land, meet new and interesting people and creatures, and kill them. And now our last member, last but not least, our level 1 Khorne Paladin. We have Zartis Darklorn. He has a kill count of 0, he has no injuries, and he has no achievements because it's session 1. We've been over this. And here's our Khorne Paladin's background. Zartis Darklorn was your typical Norsec mortal. Raised in the harsh lands of the north, his clan was devoted to the most powerful dark god the world has ever known, the great and terrible Khorne. Zartis made a name for himself early on as a marauder, slaughtering 20 high elven spearmen by himself and then offering their skulls to the great god Khorne. He quickly rose through the ranks and became a chaos warrior in record time. Years passed, and Zartis trudged the world, fighting in battle after battle, killing man, elf, dwarf, and monster with equal ease. After a particularly successful raid of the Vampire Lands, his warband returned to his home in the north, with the spoils and skulls to be properly devoted to Khorne on the clan's coveted war shrine. The ritual was being completed, but the blood moon was covered by... As the ritual was being completed, the blood moon was covered by dark clouds. No stranger to battle, Zartis and his battle brothers rose up. They knew this omen foretold of battle coming to them. Working himself into a frenzy, Zartis was ready to begin tearing into his brothers when the first wave of a skeleton horde became visible on the outskirts of his territory. The battle was as brutal as it was one-sided. Zartis and his brothers cut down scores of pathetic skeleton warriors within minutes of initial contact. Even after killing what had to be 100 of the walking undead, there seemed to be no end to them. This concerned Zartis little, for to be in the midst of combat was one of the best ways to honor the great Lord Khorne. Wading through another unit of skeletons, Zartis came upon the first live enemy he'd seen, a disgusting, pudgy necromancer that was frantically trying to resurrect the skeleton warrior Zartis had just felled. It was with no small amount of contempt that Zartis cut down the squealing magic user and cut his head from his cooling corpse. Not willing to evoke the wrath of his god with such an undeserving offer, he crushed the necromancer's skull in his gauntleted hand. A shadow fell on him, and he turned around. and when he turned around, Zartus felt a sharp pang of something he hadn't felt in over 3 decades. He felt fear. Before him stood a vampire that exuded power unlike anything he had ever seen. Remembering that Khorne was watching, Zartus felt his full fury return, and he charged the vampire lord. Even in a full sprint, the vampire easily stopped him with one hand. Snarling into Zartus' face, the vampire spoke to him with contempt. "You dared raise my lands? I am Vlad von Karstein, not some peasant lord to be trifled with. For your transgressions, I will wipe your clan off the map." With his speech given, Vlad tossed Zartus away with barely a second thought. Zartus landed hard on his head. The impact knocked him unconscious. When he awoke, he was surrounded by nothingness. His clan was gone, their corpses reanimated to join the armies of the Van Karsteins. With the rage of vengeance in what once served as his heart, Zartus began his slow trek south to find the skills, allies, and renown required to build an army that would grant him the vengeance against the hated Von Karnstein family. Zartus, Goldtusk, and Avon found themselves waiting just outside the Mercenary Guild, inside the city of Prague. Drake is inside the Mercenary Guild, registering their newly formed corporation. After the ravages of the Cataclysm War were over, Dwarven, Skaven, and Empire engineers were set to the task to rebuild the city. It took 5 years, but the combined effort of the engineers of all 3 races saw Prague rebuilt, smaller, but better than before. The city was now circular in design and split into 3 different sections. The innermost section, known as the main section, houses the castle and the nobles of Prague. The middle section, known as Midsphere, is where all the guilds, residential areas, inns, and merchants are located. This middle zone is always busy. The section of the city is why most people visit the city. The outer ring of the city, known as the outside, is the largest of the 3 sections. It is in this area all the farms and livestock of the city are kept. Outside the walls of the city for exactly a mile in every direction is nothing but open plains. This was done intentionally to give invaders no hiding spots or cover to use during an invasion or an attack. It has proven to be a better deterrent than the great cannons and warp lightning cannons that ring the outer walls of the city. Inside the walls, the city is patrolled by units of 3 to 5 Ironbreakers or 5 to 7 swordsmen with either an Iron Gut or a Man-Eater in with their rank. There is some minor crime inside the city, but for the most part, Prague is known as one of the safest places in the world. Drake is just finishing up the needed paperwork that will make him and his allies a legitimate mercenary corporation. It took the sale of almost all their worldly goods and more odd jobs than they'd like to count, but they were finally able to save up the 7,000 gold needed to register their group. He knew that by doing this, it would help him acquire the contacts and resources he needed to continue his search for the legendary Yinlinson master recipe. Signing his name for the 40th time, Drake could feel his patience wearing thin. He was a warrior, after all, not some paper-pushing pansy. Handing the final paper to the officer that was dealing with him, the man looked over the worksheet and nodded to himself. He wrote down something on a very abused-looking notebook and then handed Drake an enchanted leather-bound contract showing that he and his companions were now legitimate mercenaries. Anyone in the Empire could hire them to perform any job they wanted, and it would be 100% legal. That last part made Drake feel very pleased. There was no honor in breaking the law, after all. Looking over the contract, Drake saw that he was named as the leader of the guild. This made him slightly uncomfortable considering he hadn't discussed it with the group, but he knew he could always write someone else's name into the contract, and the enchanted pages would recognize the new person as the leader. Drake also noticed there was plenty of space in the roster section of the contract, which would allow him to write in new members to their group if the situation should arise. Smiling happily to himself, Drake secured the contract in his pack, shook the man's hand, and left to rejoin his allies. "Oi, come here, lads," Drake said as he left the guild. "We've got our papers. We're legitimate now," he said cheerily. Goldtusk and Zartus didn't seem to care much. Both were deep in conversation about how best to skin a goblin. Avon, however, took interest in the contract and began to read it carefully, line for line. The hint of a smile briefly crept across his lips before he handed the contract back to Drake. This will do nicely, Avon said. Used to his ally's demeanor, Drake barely noticed. Aye, that it will, lad. Now all we need is our first job. I can go back inside and see if there's any available, or we can ask around the city, Drake said. After a moment of thinking it over and not getting any real feedback from the party, Drake nods to himself. Well, lads, I guess I'll head back into the guild and see if there's anyone hiring. The party, not seeing anything wrong with Drake's idea, followed him back inside the building. As the party walks into the building, they immediately hear a Bretonian man half screaming at one of the guild clerks. You do not understand, you simpleton. My mining outpost is literally right outside your city, and I haven't received a shipment from them in almost 3 weeks. Everyone I've sent to investigate this has failed to return, and I'm losing gold every moment I have to explain the situation to you. You must find me some mercenaries this instant and have them sort the situation out for me, the fancy-dressed little noble said. Drake hurriedly went up to the men and interjected himself between them. Holding his mercenary papers up to the noble, he spoke. Your worries are over, lad. Me and my boys will take your contract and fix your little problem, no worries, he said proudly. The noble seemed somewhat surprised. Your boys, Sir Dwarf? Who are these boys that you reference? He asked, the hint of disrespect slowly creeping into his words. Drake motioned for the noble to look behind him. He took no small amount of pleasure from seeing the man blanch when he saw a Khorne paladin and a savage orc boss standing a few feet away from him. They were looking at him more as prey than as an employer. Drake noticed the man was beginning to tremble when Avon appeared next to him. My lord, Avon said with a hiss that would make any politician envious. We would love nothing more than to take on this job for you. However, we should discuss the terms of said contract before we agree to anything. The noble was very shaken now, but his breeding and noble background did him justice. It only took him a few seconds to regain his voice. Yes, Sir Elf. I have need of your services. I am Lord Tristan DeVoe, and I have a mining outpost a few miles from here that hasn't reported in, or sent any ore, in almost 3 weeks. I require that you go to the outpost, find out what's wrong, and correct the situation immediately. For your services, I'll gladly pay you a 25 gold down payment and 100 gold once the job is completed, Lord DeVoe said. With a nod, it was clear from his demeanor he was back in control of himself and felt he was being very generous. Avon didn't share his view. My lord, my allies and I will have no problem dealing with this inconvenience for you. However, for the task you lay before us, I believe we will be entitled to much greater compensation than a measly 25 gold to start and 100 for completion. Surely your noble house can afford to pay us more than that pittance, Avon said. His words were slick as oil as they left his mouth, and the threat on them was not lost on the noble. To his credit, the noble didn't begin to shake again, but began to sweat profusely as he fought to get a hold of his courage. Avon simply stared at the man without emotion as he waited for his response. How does 100 gold each sound as well as 500 gold paid upon completion? Lord DeVoe asked. The desperation was obvious in his voice. Avon decided to press his advantage. And? Avon asked, his left eyebrow moving up on his forehead slightly as he manipulated the man. DeVoe stammered. And you can, keep whatever you find? He asked. Smiling for the first time, Avon nodded his agreement. Lord DeVoe and Avon shook on the deal. As DeVoe hastily began to leave, he called out, Once the task is done, you just come talk to the clerk here. He will verify the job is completed and pay you your due. There's no reason to further contact me. Good day, Sir Elf, he said. The door was already closing as he spoke his parting words. Drake, Zartis, and Avon all shifted their attention to the clerk, who was laughing hard behind his hands. Goldtusk didn't seem to notice anything that was going on around him, and was instead trying to pick something green from out of his teeth. The clerk looked up. Thank you for that. He is an insufferable pig. Here's a map that will lead you to the outpost, he said as he handed Avon the map. Be warned, though. Lord Tristan has already hired one mercenary group to investigate his mine, and they've never returned. Whatever's happening here can't be good. Aebon nodded his thanks, and the group headed back outside. Well, lads, it would seem we have our first contract, Drake said. He did not attempt to hide his joy. I would say we would head out immediately. No point in wasting time sitting around here. Nodding agreement, the group headed towards the main gate. It wasn't long before they were on the road and heading towards the outpost. The group passed the time mostly in silence. They each had their own reasons for being in the group and their own demons to deal with. Aebon watched the dwarf like a hawk. It wasn't because he was overly fond of him. Truth be told, he had almost killed him on numerous occasions. It was what he was supposed to learn from him that kept the dwarf alive. They had been traveling together for over 10 years now, and he had saved him from death countless times. It never ceased to amaze Aebon how easily the dwarf could find the business end of an enemy's blade during their battles. If it hadn't been for the health potion his god had gifted him with, the dwarf would have been dust and memories long ago. Drake found himself invigorated for the first time in a long time. It felt good to be with a group that consisted of more than just him and Aebon. Not that he disliked the elf. If he was honest with himself, he had come to love him. He was very much like a brother to him. It was just that he could be very smothering at times, almost like a mother hen protecting her chicks. The thought of Aebon clucking like a chicken brought a chuckle to the old dwarf, and he had to shake his head when everyone looked quizzically at him. Goldtusk was in his own world during the march. His loyalty was to the big red-armored Who-Man and no other. As long as he was allies with the dwarf and the elf, he would be too. The big man had fought him well in their first encounter and had brought him into many fights since then that had brought him many trinkets and glory. He knew deep in his golden bones that Gork and Mork were impressed with him. He was certain that soon they would see it fit to bless him with a new and powerful clan that would bathe the world in a green tide of death. Until then, however, he played with the skull necklace of the shaman friend that hung around his neck. Ever since he found the sparkly red stones and put them into his friend's eye sockets, he felt like his friend was better protecting him. Absently, he stroked the skull's head as they walked. Zartis was a white-hot ball of simmering rage. He was only able to control his murderous tendencies by his willpower alone. He didn't care about any of these people. At best, he saw the orc as a favored pet. All they were was means to an end. His vengeance against the Von Karsteins. Blood for the blood god was all he said to himself over and over as they marched. In a few hours, the party reached the borders of the outpost. The land was dry and heavily marked by passing wagons and people passing through. The mine looked to be nothing more than a hole in the side of a large hill, and it was surrounded by a 12-foot-tall wooden wall with a large gate in the middle of it. The gate was wide open, and the outer walls of the fort showed strange damage on its beams, but other than that, all was calm. As the party ventured inside the fort, they discovered what happened to the miners and the mercenaries sent before them. In the middle of the fort, stacked 5 feet tall, was a stack of skulls, all with the mark of Khorne carved into their skulls. Zartis nodded at a job well done. It seems that all is how it should be here, he grunted to the party. Aebon smirked, and Drake let out a grunt. Goldtusk peered closely at the skulls and squinted at the markings on them. Seeing the familiar mark of the big red Who-Man made them okay in his book, and he left them alone. There were no signs of the bodies that the skulls had formerly belonged to, however. The party did notice 3 crudely carved-out symbols of Khorne in the side of the hill surrounding the entrance to the mine. Zartis immediately recognized the markings as the universal Norska sign that the mine was now claimed in the name of Khorne. He told the group this, and they peered into the mine entrance. The shaft was well lit by warp fire lanterns about 30 feet into the mine. The warp flame lanterns, while slightly volatile, did bathe the darkness in a very fine green light that was better than pitch blackness. As the party began entering the mine, they felt the ground shake and a grinding metal-on-metal sound come from behind them. Zartis and Goldtusk sprinted up the ramparts and looked over the forward wall of the fortress to see what was making the sound. Drake and Aebon walked over to the open gate and peered outside. 50 yards from the entrance to the fort stood a unit of 20 Khorne warriors with halberds, a unit of 25 Khorne Forsaken, a hell cannon, and an exalted hero of Khorne on a juggernaut. The enemy hero was in badly damaged and wore blood-red armor. As one would expect, his armor was covered in marks of Khorne and caked with gore. He wore a pair of hand axes on his belt, which were heavily marked with icons of Khorne. He rode a juggernaut which showed he was favored by the Dark Lord, and the thought sent a pang of jealousy through Zarktis' core. The most remarkable aspect of the enemy hero, however, was his helmet. It was fashioned to make his head look like a roaring dragon. It was exquisite in its craftsmanship and glowed red as the hero spoke to his army. Before the party could so much as bellow out a "Who goes there?" the hell cannon barked and sent a chaotic mass hurtling towards the fort. The party watched helpless as the shot sailed into the fort. They could do nothing else, for they were powerless to stop the chaotic mass now that it was in motion. It hit the ground on the eastern side of the fort's entrance, completely missing the walls and the allies. When the blast hit, it did not explode like a mortal cannonball or mortar would have. Instead, this was a projectile made from the bodies of the fort's former inhabitants and the raw power of chaos. Instead of a massive explosion with a hail of shrapnel sent in all directions, when the blast hit, the area exploded with butterflies of all colors, sizes, and shapes. Some of the butterflies had crystal wings and seemed to change color and shape with every beat of their wings. Others were grotesque, with open sores on their wings and taking on the color of bile. They dripped vicious fluids and defied physics in order to fly. Still others were blood red and were armed with tiny claws and teeth and set about attacking the other butterflies. It was as beautiful as it was terrifying. Except to Goldtusk. The moment he saw what was happening, he ran over to the mass of butterflies and began trying to catch them. Most of the butterflies easily evaded the clumsy orc's attempts to catch them, but he was able to catch a couple and smiled brightly as he began tearing their wings off. More concerned with what was happening outside the fort than within, the party turned their attention back to the advancing horde of chaos, except for Goldtusk, who was merrily tearing the wings off a particularly foul green butterfly. As the party began to formulate a defense, the hell cannon's muzzle began to glow red hot. The party watched helplessly as the dwarven crew that manned the war machine forced more bodies into the cannon's eager furnace. The dwarves apparently did something wrong, however, because as Abon watched them work, he saw panic take control of them and watched as the hell cannon's projectile became lodged in the barrel. Abon had just enough time to shield his eyes when the hell cannon exploded into 1,000,000,000,000 pieces. The bound demon inside, finally free of its bonds, the explosion was nothing short of miraculous. The Khorne warriors, being slower than their Forsaken allies, were obliterated to a man. The Forsaken, already at a full sprint and almost twice as fast as the warriors, only suffered a few casualties and barely let up from their charge. The hero on the Juggernaut fared much worse, however, as his mount was killed in the blast and he was sent hurtling through the air only to land hard on his back. With only 8 Forsaken left and a prone exalted hero, the party felt much better about their odds. Not one to wait, Drake immediately rushed out of the fort to meet the incoming Forsaken in close combat. Zarktis was right behind him. He'd be damned if the dwarf was going to outshine him in the eyes of Khorne. Avon tried to stop them from leaving the fort. "If we wait for them to come to us in this bottleneck, then their numbers will count for nothing. Do not charge out after them," he said. If Drake or Zarktis heard his words, they gave no sign. Goldtusk, however, not only heard what Abon said, he agreed wholeheartedly. It was an unprecedented moment of clarity for Goldtusk when he responded to Abon's advice. "Fellow elf, I agree wholeheartedly with your assessment of the situation and will make my martial stand here, with you, in the fort's entrance. This bottleneck will perfectly funnel the enemy to us in a much more manageable way that should ensure us victory," he said. He then turned his attention back towards the Forsaken and bellowed his challenge to his enemies. Abon was so taken back by Goldtusk's articulate words that it was a full round before he could close his mouth and focus on the incoming threat. Drake and Zarktis, who had no such trouble, swirling into the fray, Drake dove into 3 of the incoming Forsaken, taking a large chunk out of the torso of a particularly nasty one. Drake prepared himself for their combined counterattack when he saw 2 out of the 3 Forsaken he was engaged with suddenly become confused and stood stock still, drooling. The third enemy, however, had no such difficulty, and Drake watched in fascination as its hands morphed into razor-sharp claws. With lightning-like quickness, Drake screamed as the Forsaken drove his claws past his defenses and cut a swath of flesh from his arm. The wound bled freely and felt like liquid fire. Drake grinned excitedly. "Finally," he thought. "Today is the day I join with me ancestors." Zarktus watched as his fool dwarven ally attempted to get himself killed by the blessed Forsaken. So gifted by the gods were these men that they were completely pure predators. No mortal concerns were theirs. They lived only to hunt, only to serve corn. Zarktus couldn't help but feel envious of such gifts and of such a life. His feelings of envy quickly fueled his rage, and he let go of his control. His great axe was already coming down with lethal force as the first Forsaken came within range. As Zarktus' axe came down, it connected perfectly with the Forsaken, and he was messily cut in 2 pieces. Before either could hit the ground, however, Zarktus whirled and hit another Forsaken in the chest, devastating its ribcage and smashing the life out of it. Less than a minute into the fight, and he had already had 2 kills. He was disgusted with himself. In a fight like this, he should already be cleaning off his enemies' skulls for the sacrifice to the blood god. Goldtusk watched as the red Who-Man killed 2 Forsaken. He looked and saw that the Stunty also had 3 enemies to play with. Goldtusk felt left out, and that infuriated him. With a guttural roar, he sprinted towards the closest enemy and set his own great axe to the task of butchering. Slaughtering a Forsaken that was trying to get into the fight with Drake, Goldtusk took no end of enjoyment slamming his great axe over and over into his enemy until he was covered in blood and there was nothing left of the Forsaken's corpse but blood and gore. Looking up from his kill, he saw the big red armored enemy Human stand and advance on the Stunty.
You are a lesser son of greater sires.
The red armored exalted hero advanced quickly towards the wounded dwarf. The corn warrior towered over Drake. He slowly drew his twin axes from his belt. They were savage hand weapons covered in carefully crafted symbols of corn. His armor was as blood red as Zarktus, but as more damaged from years of abuse. The craftsman inside Drake howled at the neglect, but he pushed the thought away as he prepared to fight the blood warrior. The armored figure pointed his axe at Drake and bellowed his challenge. "You are an inferior warrior from a clan of cowards and drunks. You don't deserve to wear your beard. Fight me, and have at least one honorable memory before you die, goblin spawn." The armored enemy general's challenge echoed through the battlefield. Seething with rage at the insult, Drake threw himself at the armored figure and slammed both his axes into his breastplate. Despite the obvious damage the armor showed, it was still able to easily deflect his blows. With a speed Drake wouldn't have thought possible in such armor, his opponent brought down his axes upon him with a strength born from chaos. Drake was able to deflect neither of the axes, and they crashed down onto his left leg. Drake felt the muscles tear and give way under the impact. The bone snapped and blood gushed from the ruin that was once his leg. The pain was so intense he couldn't even scream before he lost consciousness and passed out. Abon watched the entire scene play out. The wound was mortal, and he knew that without the aid of his goddess's health potion, the dwarf would be dead soon. With a sigh, Abon opened himself to the forces of magic and created a total darkness spell around the dwarf's corpse. The spell resulted in an orb of complete darkness encompassing the dwarf, the enemy general, and the 3 Forsaken that were watching the challenge. Abon wasn't the only one to see his dwarven ally fall. Boss Goldtusk watched as the Stunty was cut down by the powerful blows, and his rage increased 100-fold. Goldtusk wasn't mad because his ally had been felled by the Who-Man. He just felt that if anyone was going to kill the Stunty, it should be him. With a roar that would have made Gork proud, or possibly Mork, Goldtusk charged the enemy hero with reckless abandon his rage is known for. Zarktus saw his dwarven ally fall as well, and moved with martial precision to fight the warrior. He did not do this because of some foolish sentiment. He wanted to kill the enemy hero because his skull would be better accepted by Khorne than any skull he could offer from the pathetic Forsaken around him. Goldtusk was 15 feet away from the enemy general when the whole world went dark. This was unlike any darkness he had encountered before, and sensation of being completely blind disoriented him badly. Swinging his great axe madly, he cut through the air around him without effect. To his right he heard what sounded like battle, but he couldn't find the source, no matter how hard he squinted. Furious, he howled his rage as he felt for his prey. Zarktis saw Avon casting a spell, and was prepared for the darkness spell when it appeared. Keeping outside of the darkness, Zarktis sneered his contempt for such magic. He knew deep in his bones that such trickery was blasphemy on the field of battle. Fury blurred his vision, and he caught himself contemplating cutting down the elf for his desecration of the battlefield. Just as he was about to charge Avon, two Forsaken came running out of the darkness. With a cruel grin, Zarktis advanced on the enemy. "Not yet, elf," Zarktis said to no one in particular, as he began cutting down the escaping Forsaken. Seeing that his darkness spell was no longer needed, Avon dropped his concentration on it and watched as it instantly ceased to exist. The enemy hero was pulling his axe out of one of the Forsaken that must have attacked him in the confusion. Goldtusk was standing about 10 feet from him. When he finally saw his target again, he did not hesitate to charge him. Goldtusk did not bother with words of warning or issuing of a challenge. Bringing his great axe down on his foe, he sliced through his armor like it was wet paper. A large chunk of armor and flesh flew from the enemy hero's body, and he roared in pain and rage and whirled on Goldtusk as he fought back. "How dare you attack me, Orc? I am Berserk, chosen of Khorne, and I will drink from your skull before the battle ends!" The enemy general roared as he fought. Boss Goldtusk was unimpressed. "Shut up and die, human!" he spat as he backhanded Berserk. The blow, which would have taken the head off a normal man, merely spun Berserk. Using his momentum, he was able to cut a slice out of Goldtusk's torso before regaining his balance. The wound would have been mortal had Goldtusk's war paint not flared with power at the last second and deflected much of the blow. Goldtusk saw the disappointment in Berserk's eyes. At this, grinning sinisterly, Goldtusk spoke again. "Gork want your head, human. I not make him wait." Furious that his attacks could be thwarted by a savage's magic, Berserk rained a flurry of blows against Goldtusk that put the Orc on the defensive. Never had the Orc been on the receiving end of such fury, and it was all he could do to avoid the blows. Just as it seemed he would fail, Gork, possibly Mork, and succumb to the onslaught, Zarktis appeared behind Berserk and hit him with a powerful blow. His attack sent Berserk's dragon helmet flying off his head. Berserk turned his back on the Orc to face this new threat, and that's when Goldtusk made his move. With another guttural roar, Goldtusk swung his great axe with all of his might, slamming the blade into Berserk's back, which exploded through his chest. Zarktis was covered in slick gore from the kill, and the sensation made him throw his head back in praise of his dark god. "Blood for the blood god!" he bellowed at the heavens. With their general dead, the remaining Forsaken proved to be no trouble for the party to finish off. With the battle over, Avon made his way to the dwarf to see if his subject still lived. When he examined the dwarf, he did not look good. His skin was ashen and pale. He wasn't breathing, and his leg was hanging on by a few strands of flesh. The blood seeping from his leg barely flowed anymore, and the spurting had completely stopped. Avon studied the sight for a moment, taking in all the details he could about this type of death. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out the health potion that would save the dwarf's life. Forcing the contents into the dwarf, he waited a moment to watch as the dwarf's leg reattached itself and the color began returning to his flesh. Seeing that the dwarf would live, Avon left his side. It wouldn't do for the dwarf to learn it had been him saving his life. Hearing the dwarf begin to moan, Avon allowed himself a small smile. He truly enjoyed denying the dwarf the honorable death he so desperately sought. Zarktis and Goldtusk were busy looting the bodies of their vanquished foes. Zarktis took Berserk's axes and placed them in his pack. He then removed Berserk's head and attached it to his belt as a trophy. Then, seeing that Goldtusk was more interested in playing in the awful than gathering any kind of loot, he recovered Berserk's helm and put it on. The helm fit him perfectly and tinted his vision red. He didn't know much about magic, but knew in his soul that this helmet was magical in nature. He felt better protected when he wore it, and decided that it was Khorne's will that he wear it. He also found a crude map on Berserk's corpse. It showed how to find the main war camp Berserk was a part of, and it had instructions written on it in Norsec. The note on the map read as follows. Berserk, ensure no one comes to reclaim our mine. Kill any you encounter. Then collapse the mine with the hell cannon and burn the fort to the ground. The message was signed, Battle Cat. As Goldtusk played with the remains of Berserk, something caught his attention near where the hell cannon had exploded. Curious, he walked over to the glint that caught his attention. Near where the Khorne warriors had been obliterated, he saw a massive tower shield, with a large spike sticking out from the middle of it. He picked it up and saw it was orc-sized at almost 7 feet tall. Zarktis walked up to inspect his new prize. With a nod, he showed the orc how to strap the shield to his back. "Now when the enemy shoots at you from behind, you'll be protected," Zarktis said to Goldtusk. Accepting this logic, Goldtusk grinned happily and went back to playing with his kills. As the two standing warriors were looting their kills, Aebon went back to check on Drake. "Oi! My leg is on fire!" Drake said through gritted teeth. Aebon smiled. "Here," he said as he handed Drake a small vial. "Drink this. It will help with the pain." Trusting his friend, Drake swallowed the liquid in the vial. Immediately the pain began to subside, and Drake found he was starting to feel really good. He couldn't even remember why he had been upset in the first place. Aebon inspected Drake's leg as the dwarf softly hummed a tune. "Drake, your left leg is broken. I estimate it will take 3 weeks to heal properly. You will need a crutch in order to get around until it fully heals," he said flatly. Drake smiled up at him. "That's nice, laddie. Thanks for the concern, but this old dwarf will be fine." Aebon left the dwarf to hum his tune. Goldtusk and Zarktis were walking over to check on the dwarf as well. Once the dwarf merrily told them his leg was broken, Goldtusk picked him up like he was a child and put him on his shoulders. This suited Aebon fine. The dwarf wouldn't aggravate his leg anymore as long as the orc was carrying him around. Aebon allowed his thoughts to drift to the drug he had given Drake. It was a concentrated form of agony he had distilled from his subject just before arriving in Prague. It was amazing how well it worked at removing the body's ability to feel pain. He named it agony due to the drug's ability to make their user immune to agony for a day. The fact that it was also extremely addictive with horrendous side effects if the user failed to acquire another dose was just good business. The party gathered at the mouth of the mine. Nothing had changed inside and there was no sound coming from within. Zarktis took a torch out of his pack and went in without a word. The party, not saying what else to do, followed. The mine shaft was crudely cut out of the side of the hill. The shaft was large enough for Zarktis and Goldtusk to walk shoulder to shoulder, with the ceiling being about 10 feet high. There were no signs of battle inside the mine shaft. The only signs of life in the mine were the multitude of tracks left in the dirt from where miners obviously had been working before they were attacked. They found a storage area full of mining equipment and supplies. They found a shaft that led to the ore vein they were mining, and towards the back of the shaft. They found a crude but effective barricade made up of heavily wooden tables, minecarts, and pickaxe heads. The barricade was only about 5 feet tall, but extended across the entire shaft, blocking their way. Goldtusk peered over the top of the barricade and easily saw 3 Bretonnian miners 20 feet behind the barricade, with very crude crossbows in hand. "Who mans with shooters back there? Want me kill?" Goldtusk asked Zarktis. Seeing an opportunity, it was Aebon that answered. "No. Let us see who they are first. They might prove useful," he said. Goldtusk looked at Zarktis, and when the armored paladin nodded his agreement, Goldtusk shrugged. Zarktis bellowed over the barricade. "You 3, back there! Come out! You're no longer in immediate danger!" From the back, one of the miners responded. "Who's there? How do we know you aren't with Berserk? Stay back or we'll shoot!" The fear in his voice was tangible. Zarktis was disgusted. Holding up the head of Berserk next to his torch so the miners could see it, he called back. "If I was with Berserk, his head would still be attached to his body, and you would be dead. Come here now!" he bellowed. The miners began to argue. "That's Berserk's head! Thank Ulrich, we're saved!" a woman's voice said. "Shut up, you twit! It's a trick! I'm going to shoot them!" a Weasley voice said. "Oh, shut up! We all know that crossbow of yours doesn't work. I'm done with you two. I'm going to them," the woman's voice said. The 3 miners appeared at the barricade and began tearing it down. Goldtusk, eager to destroy anything, began wailing away at the barricade with his axe. Within moments, the barricade was splintered ruins and the savage orc was grinning happily. The miners were in bad shape. The woman was filthy, skinny, and very pale. The men were just as bad, but they both held their crossbows still. Upon inspection, the party immediately saw that one of the crossbows would never fire, and the other one was more likely to explode in a man's hands rather than fire a bolt. Drake spoke to the miners from his perch on top of Gold Tusk. "How long have you lot been down here?" he asked with concern. It was the woman that answered. "Since the first attack a few weeks ago. There were more of us in the beginning. Some thought they could fight, others thought they could escape and get help. No one ever returned. We thought we were saved a week ago when a band of mercenaries arrived, but Berserk's warband cut them down and stacked their skulls in the fort. We gave up hope after that." Her eyes welled with tears as she recounted their ordeal. Drake was about to offer up his sympathies when Avon spoke. "You've clearly been through a lot. Come, is there a sleeping area nearby? Perhaps an infirmary? Our colleague was badly wounded during the fight and he needs rest. Food would be good too if there is any." His words were like a soothing balm to the miners' frayed nerves. They immediately began thanking the group for saving them, and one of the men walked up to Avon. I have a key to our barracks. There's a small kitchen attached to it. Plenty of mutton and water, plus a bed for your friend, my lord," the man said respectfully. Taking the key from the man, Avon motioned for the miner to lead the way. The barracks were cleverly hidden in the storage area of the mine. "Dwarf ingenuity, lads!" Drake laughed when he saw where the hidden door was. Inside were enough beds for 24 humans and a small pantry with jugs of water and salted mutton. Gold Tusk carefully set Drake on one of the beds after grabbing a few legs of mutton. Then he headed back outside to the fort. Zarktas looked around the room and then, finding nothing to catch his attention whatsoever, decided to join Gold Tusk at the wall of the fort. Together, they decided they would keep watch for any more attackers throughout the night. Avon waited for Drake to fall asleep before speaking. "You two," he said to the 2 male miners, "please prepare a meal for me and my companions. For yourselves as well. You must be famished." He almost purred as he spoke. A plan had formed in his head, and now Avon was maneuvering to set it into motion. Without questioning his order, the men went into the kitchen area to prepare the food. Avon stopped the female miner from joining them. Standing before her, the two were completely alone save for the loudly snoring dwarf. Brushing her ragged hair out of her face, Avon looked deep into her eyes. "You are beautiful. Do you know that?" he asked. His words were as gentle as his touch. The woman was floored. No one had ever called her attractive before, let alone beautiful. Do you really think so, my lord?" she asked, confused. Avon smiled. "Yes, of course I do." The woman began to tremble. With everything that had happened, being courted by this beautiful dark elf was the last thing she would have expected. Words failing her, she began to tremble. Avon had been expecting this reaction. "My dear, you are trembling. Here, drink this," Avon whispered to her as he handed her a vial from his pack. Without questioning what it was, the woman downed the contents and was unconscious within moments. Avon laid her down on the bed next to Drake and waited for the men to return. He didn't have to wait long. The men returned carrying 2 large trays full of mutton and water. Avon motioned for them to place the food on separate tables. "Please, gentlemen, eat," Avon said, with a smile. The men were grateful for his generosity, and each sat at the table they had set their food at and began eating with earnest. Disgusted at how they ate, Avon approached the closest man and drew his blade. The man looked up and smiled at Avon as the elf slid his blade between the man's ribs with barely a sound. The man's face twisted from adoration to shock and then to agony. Before he died, he was just able to squeak out a feeble question. "Why?" Avon watched as the light went out in the man's eyes. Then he laid his head down on the table. The second miner, completely oblivious to his peril, was still noisily eating his meal. Avon, not bothering with stealth anymore, walked up behind him and unceremoniously slit his throat. With his chore half finished, Avon allowed himself a smile before he began moving all 3 miners into the kitchen.
"Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dying times here."
Using some nails he found in the storage area, Avon began the task of nailing up the miners to the wall. The dead miners he simply hung by their hands after he nailed them together. Being dead already, they offered no complaint. He appreciated their silence. He always did work better in silence. The female miner proved to be slightly more of a problem. After he bound her hands and legs together, he began nailing her to the wall. Driving the nails through her hands woke her groggily from the drug-induced rest. Avon found this to be curious, as his drug should have kept her unconscious until his apparatus was attached. Shrugging, he began driving nails through her legs and feet into the wall to keep her still. Her screaming was most irritating. Outside on the wall, Zarktus and Goldtusk heard the woman's wailing. Zarktus didn't acknowledge the sound until he saw Goldtusk looking confused. "The elf is worshipping his gods. Leave it alone," he stated. Goldtusk nodded. "He should worship with less screaming. He going to wake the stunty," Goldtusk replied. Exasperated, Zarktus continued to watch for enemies and completely ignored the orc. Drake, meanwhile, slept soundly through it all. Avon allowed the woman to scream. It didn't matter much to him. She was wasting what little time she had left on this plane as far as he was concerned. Finished with securing the woman to the wall, he was setting up his agony apparatus when the woman surprised him again by speaking. "Why? Why are you doing this to me?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. Avon cocked an eyebrow before he answered. "Well, my dear, it's quite simple. You see, you escaped one monster, only to find another." With a smile so wicked a bloodletter would cringe, Avon snapped the apparatus to a woman's body and switched the machine on. Her screams didn't last long. When the deed was done, Avon carefully put the extracted fluid into one of his empty vials. He was annoyed, as always, that so much effort was required for one dose of agony. Sighing, he disconnected his machine, grabbed up some food for himself, and headed outside to check with the warriors. Goldtusk and Zarktus saw the elf coming out of the mine and nodded to him. Munching on a haunch of mutton, Avon nodded back. Looking at the battlefield, he saw the scavengers were cleaning the bodies off the field with incredible efficiency. That explained why there was no bodies left around, inside or outside of the fort. He knew that at the current rate there wouldn't be a scrap of meat left on the field by morning. Goldtusk nudged Avon, snapping him out of his thoughts. "How's the stunty? You worship loudly," Goldtusk grunted. Avon shrugged. "The dwarf will survive. My worshipping did not disturb him." Goldtusk nodded. "Where are miners?" Avon didn't miss a beat. "Sleeping." Goldtusk grunted his acknowledgement and went back to watching the scavengers work. Zarktus spoke next. "The dwarf must rest tonight. Then we should head to the war camp on the map we found on Berserk. There will be more there that need killing." It wasn't a question. Zarktus was stating a fact. Avon didn't argue. He simply nodded and continued eating his meal.
"Shiny. Let's be bad guys."
The night passed without incident. In the morning, Avon did what he could with his clerical powers to speed up the dwarf's recovery. Then he was able to create a makeshift crutch out of some pickaxes he found in the storage area. With Drake up and moving about, Avon judged his leg would be good in a couple of weeks. Until then, the dwarf would not be able to run, sprint, or charge. Satisfied with Drake's progress for the moment, he tossed him a leg of cold mutton, and they made their way outside to join Zarktus and Goldtusk. Goldtusk smiled broadly when he saw the dwarf limping towards them. "You live, stunty! Good!" he said. Drake gruffly nodded. The sentiment soared towards him, bringing a tear to his eye that he quickly wiped away. "Aye, lad, it wasn't quite my time yet again." Try as he might, he couldn't keep the disappointment out of his voice. Zarktus was annoyed. "It's time to go. Will you be able to keep up, dwarf?" he asked. Before Drake could answer, Goldtusk had him up on his shoulders once again. "He no slow us down. Come, more humans to crump," Goldtusk stated. With that, Goldtusk began making his way west. Sighing, Avon called out, "Goldtusk, we're heading northeast." The party was only a half-mile away from the X on the map when Zarktus and Avon noticed the complete silence of the area. It was the middle of the day, and they were in a wild field with tall grasses and willow trees peppering the landscape. Birds and other animals should have been almost deafening here, but there weren't so much as insects buzzing around. 20 minutes of scouting revealed the enemy war camp in a small valley nearby. The party decided to find a secluded spot and wait until nightfall before scouting the camp. Nightfall fell without incident, and the party made their way towards the war camp. Angry voices were bellowing from the valley. The angry Norsec words could only be understood by Zarktis and Avon, but they were not friendly words. "You killed my warhound, dead man!" a whimsical voice called out. "It only died because you were attached to its ass! I was aiming for you, coward!" a furious deep voice shouted back. "All of you calm down, or I will bring down the wrath of the gods on your heads!" a third voice shouted. There was a strong sound of authority coming from the third voice. Zarktis and Avon both knew without a shadow of a doubt he was the leader of the warband. "We need to get eyes on that camp and see what we're dealing with, now," Zarktis said to the party. Avon and Drake agreed. "I'll cast a darkness spell at the ridge of the hill. Someone can sneak up to the ledge and recon the war camp," Avon suggested. Goldtusk immediately volunteered. "I cast spell!" he offered. Avon rolled his eyes, and Zarktis looked ready to punch the orc. Drake diffused the situation by telling the orc to set him down. "Lad, I'll sneak through your spell. Cast it already. Time be wastin'." Without waiting for someone to disagree, Avon concentrated and carefully cast his spell. The darkness orb was targeted perfectly, and Drake dove in without hesitation. Unfortunately for the party, Drake pushed himself a little too hard and made a bit of a ruckus while negotiating his way through the orb of darkness. The party watched as Drake's torso and shoulders appeared on the ledge of the hill, and he noisily complained about his leg as he went prone. Fortunately for Drake, however, the enemy didn't seem to hear the dwarf due to the screaming and arguing happening around the camp. The warhounds circling the camp, however, took notice of the wounded creature sticking out of the night. Crouching low, the Chaos Warhounds began to stalk their unsuspecting prey. Drake looked over the war camp, and what he saw had him worried. Calling out to Avon, far too loudly for the elf's liking, Drake described what he faced. "Lad, there's about 20 Khorne warriors down there with halberds and shields. There also be 15 Slaanesh warriors down there with hand weapons and shields." He let the worry slip into his voice, unashamed to let his allies know he was concerned. He wished for a glorious death. He did not want to see his allies suffer his fate if they could avoid it. Drake watched as the two factions of enemy warriors parted and a third threat revealed himself. Drake lowered his head in defeat. "Lads, they've got a Slaanesh sorcerer on a white lion down there. I think we know who Battlecat is now. By Grimnar's whiskers," Drake said. Shushing the dwarf, Avon, Goldtusk, and Zarktis made their way to the ridge of the hill. If the enemy didn't notice the half-yelling dwarf in their midst, they figured they could risk a peek. When Zarktis looked down and saw what was happening, a hungry grin bringing behind his helm. "Relax. I know exactly what to do." Zarktis reached into his pack and pulled out the 2 Khorne-marked axes he had taken off the body of Berserk. Still trying to keep to the shadows, he got as close as he dared to the arguing warband. He knew from past experiences that when a warband began fighting like this, it would only take the slightest spark to set off the powder keg. Rearing back, Zarktis threw both axes at the massed unit of Slaaneshi warriors. One of the axes sailed so far off course it may not have landed in the valley. The second axe, however, flew true and sailed directly into the brain pan of an unexpecting Slaaneshi warrior. The warrior was dead before he hit the ground. Berserk had to bite his tongue to stop himself from screaming his praise to the blood god. The Slaaneshi warriors were shocked when one of their own fell and searched for the source of the attack. Failing miserably to determine where the axe had come from, one of the warriors lifted the axe for all to inspect. The moment they saw the Khorne symbols etched into the axe, they bellowed their hate and the betrayal and charged at the Khorne warriors in front of them. The sorcerer leader bought the ruse as well. The party watched in fear and awe as the sorcerer sent a magical lash at the Khorne warriors, killing 2 of them before combat began. Avon, Zarktis, and Goldtusk stayed in the shadows to watch the slaughter when they saw movement from Drake. The dwarf was trying to get up so he could jump into the fight. The warhounds saw their prey begin to move, and they lunged at him. Drake didn't know what hit him until he smelled the hot dog breath on his face. Fortune smiled down on him once again, however, as when the warhounds jumped to attack him, they collided in midair. One of the hounds recovered and landed on its feet. The other didn't fare as well and landed at Drake's feet, prone and helpless. Drake wasted no time in dispatching his would-be assassin. Rising painfully to his feet, Drake squared off against the surviving hound. They began circling each other, looking for a weakness in their defense. Avon, Zarktus, and Goldtusk watched as Drake fought the warhounds. Zarktus scoffed as the first warhound was killed after botching his attack. Looking down at the battle between the warriors, Zarktus had enough. With a hearty, "Blood for the Blood God!" Zarktus charged the Slaaneshi warriors from behind. Goldtusk, not one to shy away from a scrap, was hot on Zarktus' heels, bellowing an orky battle cry of his own. Wog! Avon watched as the warriors charged into the fray. Annoyed, and a little bored, he unslung his light crossbow and knocked a bolt. He was carefully taking aim at the sorcerer when he heard the low grumbling of a large dog behind him. Spinning around, Avon moved just in time to avoid having his throat ripped out by a duo of Chaos Warhounds. The animals were scaly and almost beautiful in appearance. Had Avon been affected by such things, he may have hesitated. He wasn't, however, and promptly fired his bolt into the eye of the closest warhound. Dropping his spent crossbow, he drew his sword. "Come at me, mongrel. Time to meet your god," he spat at the surviving warhound. Drake attempted to keep up with the warhound's maneuvering, but his leg was slowing him considerably, and he knew the hound saw it. Fed up with this game of cat and mouse, Drake sprang at the warhound, disregarding all defense. As the warhound's teeth sank into his shoulder, Drake drove his axes through the hound's neck, severing its head from its body. Drake's heart was beating hard in his chest as he turned his attention to the swirling melee of warriors behind him. He didn't hesitate. Spinning on his leg, he began to charge down the hill. His leg failed him, however, and he went down to one knee. The pain was sharp and total. His vision began to blur, and for a moment he worried he would pass out. Fighting through the pain, Drake forced himself to stand, recalling the faces of his fathers to give him strength. Regaining his feet, Drake limped his way towards the battle, slower this time and with more caution. Zarktus and Goldtusk waded into the combat and immediately began taking a toll on the enemy. Zarktus was killing 2 warriors at a time, and as he did so, he would bellow at Goldtusk. "That is how you kill a man, orc!" He intentionally goaded the orc. He knew it would get his ire up and improve the orc's fighting. Goldtusk knew none of this. All he knew was that the red-armored Human was killing more than him, and the fact infuriated him. He felt something tingle deep inside him and watched his vision turn red. With a primal roar, Goldtusk bellowed out his war cry that infused him and Zarktus with killing fury known only to the orcs. Zarktus and Goldtusk fought like Gork reincarnated. The Slaanesh warriors fell before their onslaught like lambs to the slaughter. Bathed in the blood of their enemies, the allies waded through the infantry, oblivious to the wounds they were receiving. Avon feinted to the left and pretended to trip. When the warhound came in for the kill, Avon neatly pierced the animal's heart and kicked the corpse away from him with disdain. Sheathing his blade, he kicked the crossbow up into his hands and knocked another bolt. He had been watching the sorcerer this whole time and knew the true threat came from him. Taking a knee, Avon waited patiently for the sorcerer to begin casting another spell. He intended to drill his bolt through the man's throat the moment he did. Drake made his way as quickly as he could down the hill in order to get into the fight. The shame he felt for falling was all-consuming. Then he heard Goldtusk scream his racial war cry. A wave of fury washed over him. His pain vanished, as well as all feelings other than the need to kill. Upping his pace, Drake slammed into the flank of Khorne warriors and cut him down with a flurry of blows. The Khorne warrior next to the one Drake felled hit Drake across the face with the haft of his halberd. The blow split open his cheek and blood freely flowed down his face. Throwing himself at the warrior, Drake wrapped his hands around his helm and twisted it around so violently the warrior's head came off inside. Throwing the helmet with the head still attached at the next warrior, he continued with his slaughter until there were no enemies left on the field. Goldtusk cut down another Slaanesh warrior and found himself standing before the mounted sorcerer lord. The lion he rode was paper white, but flawless in every other aspect. Its fur was unmatted and laid perfectly upon its body. Its claws and teeth were as flawless as they were lethal, with not so much as a drop of blood on him anywhere. The sorcerer himself was wearing perfectly polished chaos armor that gleamed. A single Slaaneshi symbol adorned the chest of his armor, and Goldtusk had to fight the urge to bow before this monster. The sorcerer held a staff that was equal parts erotic and chaotic. The battle gaze that Goldtusk had been under lifted at the sight of this new foe, and he was stunned for just a moment as he convinced himself he had to kill this beautiful creature. Looking down at the orc with contempt, the sorcerer began to cast his final spell that would cause him to tear himself apart. The first words of his spell were just leaving his lips when a crossbow bolt bounced off his armor. Distracted, he failed to cast his spell. He looked up to find the source of the bolt and saw a dark elf calmly reloading his crossbow. Swinging with all his might, Goldtusk embedded his axe into the shoulder of the lion. Black blood spurt from the wound, and Goldtusk immediately regretted his actions. To mar something so beautiful felt wrong in a primal way. His shame was all-consuming. Goldtusk watched with tears in his eyes as the lion came at him, pounced on him, and ripped a chunk out of his flesh. He did nothing to resist. The pain that his body registered was nothing compared to the pain he felt in his heart. He knew he deserved this for what he had done. It was Zarktis that unintentionally saved Goldtusk from becoming the lion's next meal. With a rage known only to the devoted followers of Khorne, Zarktis jumped through the air and slammed his axe into the chest of the lion. The impact sent the sorcerer toppling off the mount and crushed the life out of the beast. Its body landed on top of Goldtusk, who found himself feeling like he was coming out of a mushroom-induced dream. The sorcerer landed hard and was momentarily stunned as he attempted to scramble to his feet. Zarktis was not going to give him that chance. With a double-handed overhead blow, he drove his axe blade through the sorcerer's torso, ripping apart every major organ the man had on its way through his body. Planting his axe in the ground, Zarktis bellowed to his god, "Blood for the blood god! Skulls for the skull throne!" Ah! With the battle won and the enemy general defeated, the lone surviving warrior broke and ran from the fight. Avon calmly drew his sword and moved to intercept the fleeing enemy. Coming up from behind, Avon drove his sword through the armor of the fleeing Chaos Warrior and laughed as he watched the life drain from his body. With the battle won, the party took stock of their condition. Drake was on death's door again and needed healing badly. He had more wounds on his body than one would have thought possible and still survive. Zarktis had many new wounds, but none were fatal. Over time they would heal themselves and he would be ready for the next fight. Goldtusk was sitting down, breathing heavily after his ordeal, but thanks to his orcish fortitude, he was already healing. Even Avon found himself wrapping a wound on his arm from his fight against the Warhounds. The party wasted no time searching the camp for loot. Mostly they found heavily used halberds, shields, and hand weapons. The chaos armor the defeated enemy wore couldn't be used by anyone in the party due to it being grafted to the bodies of the fallen. Zarktis removed the heads of all the fallen and offered them all to Khorne, which was his custom. Upon finding the sorcerer's body, he removed his head and attached it to his armor as a trophy. Goldtusk had removed the head of the white lion he had helped kill and was working the lower jaw of the head, making it open and close. Zarktis saw this and did not approve. Walking over to the orc, he took the lion's head from him and shoved it onto the spike of the tower shield Goldtusk now wore on his back. Patting the orc hard on the back, he nodded to his ally and went on with his task of collecting skulls. Avon searched the body of the sorcerer and found nothing of any use or value on his corpse. Finding his staff, Avon carefully inspected it and immediately recognized it as an arcane item. In untrained hands, items like these can be more devastating than a misfiring hell cannon. Looking around, Avon saw that Zarktis had started a large fire and was piling the bodies into the flames. Gingerly picking up the staff, Avon tossed it into the flames. "Fuck everything Slaanesh," he said with disgust as he fed the staff to the flames. Zarktis nodded in approval. With the bodies cleared, the allies searched the two tents that were in the camp. One was a pitifully tiny tent. Inside was the corpse of an Empire man. His face was blue, his tongue was swollen and purple, and his eyes bulged out of his head. He was in a commoner's clothing that had the name Wampy written across it, and had a ham sandwich clutched in one hand. A single bite had been taken from the sandwich. Avon and Drake quickly ascertained that the unfortunate fellow had made camp here before the Chaos Warriors had arrived, set up his tent for the night, and proceeded to eat his ham sandwich dinner. He choked to death on the first bite. Some people are just born unlucky. Upon rummaging through the tent, Avon was able to find a potion of foolhardiness hidden beneath Wampy's bedroll. Seeing how the dead man wouldn't be needing it anymore, he pocketed the potion. The final tent was obviously the sorcerer's. It was made from what appeared to be the finest silk and was impeccably clean. Symbols of Slaanesh embroidered into every inch of the fabric, and each was perfect in its creation. Sickened to his core at the sight, Zarktis dipped his hand into a puddle of blood on the ground and advanced on the tent with the intent of desecrating it. The moment he touched the tent, however, his body convulsed as uncontrollable seizures racked him. Blood spurted from his wounds as his muscles tightened to impossible tenseness. The reaction only lasted a moment, but it knocked Zarktis unconscious for a minute, and when he awoke he did not dare touch the tent again. Avon was having none of it. Wrapping one of his bolts in a rag, he set fire to it and shot it into the tent. In a few minutes the entire tent was a flaming inferno. With the job done, the enemies torched, and their tents set ablaze, the party decided to return to the outpost to rest up before returning to Prague and completing their contract. With their mission complete, the party made haste back to the outpost to rest their weary bones. The journey to the fort was accented by Drake humming a dwarven victory song.
Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, the pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night, the fire was red, it flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light.
Upon arriving at the mining fort, the Allies found nothing disturbed. Drained and exhausted, the party locked the door to the barracks and fell into the beds. All were sleeping or in deep meditation almost immediately. The next morning, Avon served the group food he had scavenged from the kitchen. Once all were sated, they made their trek back to Prague. When the Allies arrived back in Prague, they wasted no time and headed straight for the Mercenaries Guild. The guild was surprisingly empty for midday, but the Allies paid the fact no mind. Drake went straight up to the clerk they had dealt with when they received their mission and slammed the contract on his desk. "Mission accomplished, laddie," Drake announced with a huge smile. The clerk was shocked by the suddenness of Drake's words and momentarily speechless. After reading over the contract, he looked over at the party, and a look of skepticism was plain on his face. "What proof do you bring that you accomplished this feat?" he asked. His tone flirted with disrespect, and Zarktis was not having it. Stomping over to the little man's desk, Zarktis dropped the heads of Berserk and Battlecat directly in front of him. There was still just enough bodily fluids in the heads to leave a small splatter on the clerk's desk. The clerk did not recoil at the sight. Instead, he carefully inspected the heads. After a moment, his eyes grew wide. When he addressed the Allies, it was with a newfound respect. "Well, I'll be a dwarf's beard's trimmings. This is the criminal Berserk, and his overlord Battlecat. Which one of you slew the sorcerer?" the clerk asked in awe. Zarktis pointed a thumb at himself while he glowered at the man. Nodding, the clerk searched around his desk for a moment and then produced a gold ring with a large ruby adorning it. "There was a bounty on Battlecat's head. I speak for the Mages Guild when I say, thank you for your deed, Sir Paladin. Here is your reward for bringing this fugitive to justice," the clerk said. Finishing his little speech, he held the ring up for Zarktis to take. Barely glancing at the trinket, Zarktis took the ring and tossed it into his pack. He then recovered his trophies and reattached them to his belt. Without a word, Zarktis went outside to wait for the party. He knew if he was near the weaselly little man for much longer, he would kill him. His skull was not one that the Dark Lord craved. The clerk watched Zarktis leave. Irritation was plain on his face, but he was smart enough to know not to give voice to his thoughts. With a slight shrug, the clerk returned his attention to Drake. "Well, Master Dwarf, I do not doubt that you've completed this task," he said. Reaching into a locked drawer, he pulled out a good-sized leather bag that made the joyous sound of gold coins clinking together. "House DeVoe thanks you for your service. Here's your reward. When you're ready, please come back to see if anyone else has need for your group," the clerk finished. Drake thanked the man and grabbed up the gold. The group divvied up the gold between them, with Goldtusk giving his share to Zarktis. Since he was made of gold, this orc had very little need for gold coins being kept on his person. When he needed gold, he would just rip out a tooth. They grew back. "Got plenty of gold teeth grow back," he said. The tone in his voice implied the party should have figured that out by now. With their first contract successfully completed and the reward distributed, Drake addressed the group. "Come, lads, let us celebrate this moment in true dwarvish fashion. First round is on me," he said gleefully. Not one to turn down a free drink, the party made their way towards the best inn in town. Alrighty, here's a quick recap of our mission because they successfully completed it. These are the kills that the party got. Keep in mind that this whole story and everything like that is, yes, I set up the scenario, the environment, and the mission. The guys have to get through it, so everything that happened because the players, the dwarf, the elf, the paladin, and the fighter did it. It had nothing to do with me. So these are the kills that they made, not that just died around them, because God knows, like the Hell Cannon, for example, exploded. But yeah, they killed 8 Forsaken, 6 Khorne Warriors, 14 Slaanesh Warriors, 4 Warhounds, 3 Miners, the Exalted Hero of Khorne, Berserk, and the Chaos Sorcerer of Slaanesh, Battlecat. And he was a level 2 wizard. So yeah, they actually killed a lot. They did really good.
Oh.
And here's a quick loot recap. And the only reason I've thrown this on here is that everybody can follow along with all the magical or unique loot that they found and who has it, what they did with it, blah blah blah. So with this particular session, Zarktis was able to find the dragon helm looted off of Berserk's corpse. That was the helmet that looked like the dragon's head roaring. Basically, it gives him +1 AC and 15 damage reduction off of all flaming damage. So that's actually probably one of the most powerful items they found. There was a tower shield that Goldtusk has that they found off the Khorne Warriors. It was on the unit champion. Basically, it's just an enchanted shield. It ups his armor save and stuff like that. There was a potion of foolhardiness that Aebon has that they found amongst the possessions of the dead Wumpy. And the Allure of Slaanesh staff that was destroyed by Aebon and indirectly Zarktis that was found on Battlecat's corpse. So yeah, they actually found some loot and they actually destroyed one of them. So that was kind of funny. Just want to give a quick shout out to Kayla. He was the individual that was responsible for a lot of the black and white pictures that you're seeing, the really good ones, especially all the profiles of the PCs in this game. If you guys are interested in maybe getting your characters, a picture or something like that, feel free to send her an email real quick and say, who you are, what you want. And for, a price, I'm not sure how much, because that's completely between you and her, you guys might be able to get her to do a caricature of your character, which would be awesome, unique, and everybody would be so jealous. But yeah, send her an email, get yourself a little caricature done of you or your champion, or however you want to get it done. Just do it. And that's it for this one. It's the first ever D&D/Warhammer narrative report. Like I said, we're doing D&D 3.5. I've got a handful of buddies that all have characters in it, and they'll swap out session to session. Some will be in there one, some won't be in there, but we're going to storyline it all out so that they, it makes sense, or close enough anyway. I know it's not perfect. It's my first time. None of you are perfect your first time. So if you have any suggestions, anything that you really liked or anything that you really hated, no matter how minute the detail might be, go ahead and throw it in the comment section. Anything that you can tell me is going to help me improve these, because they are fun to do. Everyone's excited about them. Everyone's enjoying doing them. So the more excited and hyped up we get, the more we're going to do. And also, if you have fan art that you'd like to submit, if you have music you'd like to submit, if you have a character name you'd like to see added into the story somewhere, feel free to put it in the comment section below. It's the worst comes to worst, I don't use it. Oh no, you're out, nothing. But more than likely I will, because the more fun we have with it, the longer it'll last. But as always, guys, this is a lot of fun, and if you can think of anything at all that you would add or remove from this, feel free to throw it into the comment section. And if it's a good enough idea, I just might implement it. But yeah, guys, thanks.